Hello and welcome to this short video on the very basics of knot tying. When we tie knots in surgery, we base everything around the throwing of half hitches, and these can be used to form many different knots, but the most important knot that we tie in surgery is a reef knot, and that is two alternating half hitches which creates a squared knot, a lock knot, and one that's really secure, such that wounds will not dehiss, which means separate after we've closed them. In addition, if we're tying off blood vessels and things, it's handy to tie a really good knot, otherwise you can have bleeding after the surgery. So I'm going to show you the basics of a squared half hitch, and for this demonstration I'm just going to use the intact skin because I think it's a lot clearer. I've chosen a very large suture gauge, a 2.0 monofilament here, to demonstrate the throwing of the knots, but also how a reef knot or two alternating half hitches looks once it's thrown. So imagine there is a wound between where I've thrown this suture across, and I've got the two ends here. I want a short end on one side of the wound and the rest of my stitches is on the other side, so I can use it for multiple stitches here. And you can see I've put my needle safely to one side in a sterile area on the wound, so that it's not going to stab the patient somewhere else. And then grasping the suture with my hands, so that I've got a decent length on the long length of the suture, but also making sure that the rest of the suture is out of my way and doesn't get in my way when I'm tying my knot. So generally, if you imagine that there's a circle running between these two sutures, and this is really helpful because every movement that you make is going to be in this circle. So to start, you're going to create a circle towards your long limb that you're holding, and you're going to wrap one turn around the top of your needle holder, and you're going to grasp the short suture and switch sides. So you're going to pull the short end towards you and the long end away from you. And you can see that that's a quite a loose knot, and it springs back open because it's a monofilament suture and it's not got high friction. To complete a reef knot, then the circle exists again, and this time you're going to come from within, you're going to come back over the top, single throw over the top of the needle holder, grasp your suture end and cross again. So you can see that's coming together really nicely as a nice, beautifully symmetrical squared reef knot. And as I pull tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter, it's going to slide down because it's a monofilament suture, and you can see it's starting to lock. It's not quite locked because again it's a monofilament suture, and we can keep laying squared reef knots on the top of that like this. So there's our circle. So we're going to come from within, grasp and switch. We're going to come within, grasp and switch, and you can keep laying reef knots on top of reef knots. So that's now 3 reef knots we've tied. That's 4 reef knots we're about to tie. That's the 4th one, every time squaring it. So you can see here, and then I'd cut that. So here you've got a stack of 4 squared reef knots on top of each other. And when you're using a monofilament suture, such as to tie off vessels down deep dark holes, this is classically how people would tie it, with multiple reef knots on top of each other. I want to show you now why this is really important. If we come to the wound in the top right hand corner of the screen, which has a wound that's going to be closed under some degree of tension, and we set this up again with a single bite and a single bite. So again, our short end is going to be away from us, our long end is going to be towards us. I'm pulling it through till I've got a sensible distance there. I'm parking my sharp to one side in the sterile area, and I've got my circle set up here. So this time I'm going to do a single half hitch like you just learnt and pull it towards me. But this time I've got distracted, and though I know what to do, I end up doing the same direction rather than this, which is correct to create a squared reef knot. I end up doing the same throw and grasping my short end and squaring my knot. Now this time I've tied a granny knot, and a granny knot is a stitch that will slip. And with time, if you tie off a vessel, you can see that I can just pull it out here. I can pull the knot that I've tied out like this, and it runs down and it slides. It's a sliding knot. So I can slide it all the way down, keep sliding it, and eventually it will come out and the patient will bleed or the wound will dehiss. It's not a squared reef knot, and that's called a granny knot. So that's not a suture that we would classically recommend ever tying in a wound closure environment. Sometimes we tie granny knots to increase the friction within the system. For example, if I were to take the bites again and I put one throw on it like we've learnt properly, and I put that down there, and I want to put a bit more friction in the system, so I take another throw again. Here comes the friction. You can see it's gradually closing the wound, so it's sliding. Maybe I do another one in the same direction. Yeah, again, pulling that down, still sliding, increasing the friction. And now I'm like, that's quite good now, but I know that that's a granny knot, that's a slip knot. All I need to do then is tie a squared reef knot on top of that stack, and that becomes locked. So to do that, I've got one limb here and one limb up here. So I'm going to create that circle. This is my circle. I'm going to come inside to out and square the knot on top, and then I'm going to do the opposite, inside to out and square the knot. So what I've done there is I've tied 3 half hitches in the same direction, which is called a granny knot, and then on top of that I've done alternating half hitches with a reef knot, and that is a perfectly acceptable way of using knots to close a wound and to have it locked such that it won't come out and it will give a nice secure closure. So in summary, make sure you get good at tying reef knots. We're going to put our stitch through the wound. We're going to create our short end and our long end. We're going to remember the imaginary circle, and we're going to take the circle round, cross hands, the imaginary circle in the other direction, cross hands, part the knot at one side, and maybe put another locking half hitch in the opposite direction. So 3 is normally what we would advise. So you've got 1, 2, 3 alternating half hitches, which is a reef knot on top of a reef knot, and then cut your ends. And that is how the basics of knot tying will help you in your wound closure.